Do. Welcome to day 2 of talking about the principles of animation. And we're finally back on YouTube. Hooray! So, yeah, hello. I don't really know if there's a whole lot of housekeeping stuff. I made some pretty good headway on getting caught up with grades. I'm still gonna make more this week, but that's going well. Things are looking good overall. I'm providing feedback. Thank you anybody who dipped the toe into Sync Sketch. It's actually kind of cool to give feedback there. So just let me know through Discord chat or something if you post something there. But otherwise, again, everything looks really good. Please remember to submit as a GIF. And I did post a tutorial video on how to do that in one of the tutorial channels on Discord. Or as a video files are good. Yeah, video files or GIFs are preferred. Don't just send me your raw blend files because what I want you to do is get used to presenting finished stuff instead of like presenting out of the tool. So we see this a lot with like 3D. People will just either hand me the raw 3D without rendering it. It's that kind of thing. Like I want you to show me the finished product. It's the same thing as like if you post this is why if you take my Games for Education class, people who've had that or who might have had me in game prototyping, which I don't think is anybody in this group. In the 1230, there's like 1 or 2 people who've already had that class. But that's why I usually ask for it to be like on Itch or GameJolt, because I want you to make a build and debug that build rather than just like relying on it always being out of the game engine. Because I want you to get the feeling of like finishing stuff. So that's if that's you, make sure and I've made sure that like assignments do have other like second, third, or infinite chances to submit work. So if you got a half grade because you submitted a blend file, just resubmit, you'll be fine. In terms of other stuff, also reminder that for the homeworks for last week, this week, and next week, where you had on the syllabus and on the assignments three things to do, you can do 2 of the 3. And again, the goal of that is so that you all of the exercises were built so that they could be in an in-person class, and that would work for an in-person class when everybody's a little more in like their normal headspace. But this semester and this year being what it is, blah, I wanted to at least relieve some of that pressure. And then soon after this, we're mainly going to be, I think there's a few more assignments that are like just practice, animation practice. But remember that the final project, which is an animatic, is going to be it's not a full short, it's an animatic. It is going to be done, like you'll have homework assignments that will help you build to it. It's not that you have like homework and then a final project to balance. It's that these all feed into each other so that you're not splitting your attention. So let me know if there are any questions. I am starting to do, just to get like the chat going a little bit more, I'm starting to do the thing that I've done in in-person classes, which is I do the thing where I'll be like, hey, ask me 2 questions before we move on. And those questions can be anything. The reason I do that is just like, especially now, it's really weird. I'm going to have this moment of vulnerability that I showed to my other session. But like, it's really hard to to teach to a camera. And I know that we're all looking at cameras and video windows, but like, you know, when it comes to teaching, like I really miss the ability to see faces. And like I've only ever taught before all this like one online class, and like I'm glad to have had the experience. It was Games for Education last year, and I'm glad to have had the experience because it helped me prep for obviously all online everything. But especially with this class, I really do miss the opportunity to like see people and see body language. And I made the point that like I think with online communication, the thing that really stinks about it is that everybody, I think, is, I mean, stop me if you've heard this one. You know, when you get an email, everybody always assumes that the email is maybe more like angry than even like the sender intended. You know, email and written stuff just comes across like that. I think Discord comes across, like any text chat can come across like that. Especially when somebody's like just trying to write concisely. So, and I think that like gets everybody a little bit on edge. So the thing about teaching is that like, you know, when you're teaching to a text box and like nothing happens in the text box, you're like, oh no, are they paying attention? Are they learning? Is the material coming through? Are they enjoying the class? Are they bored? So, you know, that's why I'm gonna like try to do some in class techniques that I've learned to like get things going, because I want to communicate with you. I hope you're enjoying the class. But like let's get chatting, especially now that we're in the principles, because like this is it. This is like the core of what we're doing. And today we're going to continue talking about that core by talking about follow through. We're going to talk about overlapping action. We're going to talk about slow in, slow out. We're going to talk about arcs and secondary action. So, topics, follow through and overlapping, slow in, slow out, arcs, and secondary action. Also, I found out that apparently the company that made this GIF, La China Creative Services, they're in Cleveland. So there's a company to potentially keep your eye on for job postings. Always happy to have Northeast Ohio locally made animation on the slideshow. Also, let me know if I cut in and cut out. This is a very GIF heavy presentation, and if I start to cut in and cut out, then you know, if the stream starts getting spotty, let me know if I need to repeat anything. Like I said, GIF heavy, and that can slow down the stream a little bit. I've tried to get rid of other like web bandwidth eating services. You know, like Steam is shut off and all that other stuff. So, but we'll see how everything works out. So the first one that we're going to talk about is follow through and overlapping action. And those two things are paired because they're very closely associated. So basically, this is another of the principles that deals with the idea of the physical reality, or trying to establish a physical reality to your character, to your animation, whatever it is. So follow through is that if there are any loosely tied parts of the body, so think of clothing, capes, dresses, hair, you know, anything like that. If there's anything that's like loosely connected, you know, it will continue moving when the body stops, or it will move behind the rest of the body. So it'll like, you know, react to the rest of the body in reaction to the forces of inertia. So this is the princess from our Little Nemo game, and she is a very follow-through heavy character because she has a dress. She has this like shawl that we actually started using once we figured out like, okay, this thing is going to follow through in a lot of potentially interesting ways. We started playing with it and used it almost like as a means for her to like control her magic power, because she's like going to be our spellcaster which in our game really means that she has projectiles, whereas other characters don't. So, you know, that has followed through. Her hair has followed through. But basically, it's like stuff that follows behind her other movements. So then you also have this sense of overlapping action. Now, overlapping action is also very similar to another principle we're going to talk about later called secondary action. What makes overlapping action distinct is that it is different parts of the body will move on different timings, and this is based largely on, again, physical reaction. So what I mean by that is, you know, if you see the princess running, her braid will flop behind on the timing. So it's not that it's using like, you know, keyframes shifted over, though you could do that. It's that, you know, if she's going up, her braid will go up, or her braid will go down, and then she will, you know, when she comes down in the run, the braid might still be going up because it is still reacting to the earlier force. And it's not until she's well into her down part of her run that the braid will follow through. So there's like a delay on stuff, you know, physically following through, and that, you know, that produces, again, like a sense of physical reality. And then drag, when parts of the body require a few frames to catch up to the rest. Again, the principle of this, so that's drag, but, you know, also if the princess stopped and then her braid went like that, you know, that would be drag. You know, it'd be like it slowing down and coming to a stop. So, I want you to tell me a little about what you see here. First question here is, what the body do you suppose is creating the force here? What is the main, like, what is the thing moving in this scene? Like, what part of the body is the main driver of this movement? Stream is lagging a bit, but okay. So it seems like head. Yeah, it's his head. So his head is like he's tired, and his head is weighing down the rest of his body and making him fall to the ground. So when his head hits the ground, like what? Then what happens? Like what other parts are reacting to? And then would you say, I guess the other question is this a realistic version of this motion? Yeah, I can't do anything about the lagginess. It's just, you know, having GIFs, which you can't really not have on a, I don't know why it's lagging, but yeah, there's nothing really I can do about it. His backside rises up, yeah. Okay, get out of here, Adobe. So other things that, so do you think this is like a realistic version of this kind of motion, or do you think it's like emphasized or like exaggerated? I wouldn't say yeah. So it is more exaggerated, and the reason is again, it's a question of style, where you're going to have his rest of his body move in a way almost like he's doing the worm. You have like his nose bounce up, you have his body bounce up, to really sell this idea of him being an exaggerated cartoony character. Now here we have Bambi. Now this is actually like a pencil test for Bambi drawn by Milt Kahl. And where do you see follow through here? Follow through, anybody? Where do we see it? The tail, yeah. So the tail's providing a pretty significant amount of follow through. Anything else? So the other place you'd see a pretty significant amount of follow through on Bambi is on his ears, and Bambi is the ears. So Bambi is very different from that other character we looked at. It's not like Bambi is rendered 100% realistically. Like he obviously has a cartoon character face, but his movements are otherwise very, very realistic to the way a deer would move. And so the follow through is a lot more subtle on things like the ears. Now the tail is doing a lot of like flopping around, but the ears in particular are a lot more, there's a lot more subtlety to them than there would be in a much more cartoonier cartoon. And then same thing here, Princess Aurora, Sleeping Beauty, drawn by Mark Davis. So again, this would be in like the 1950s. Where do we see follow through and overlapping action happen here? There's two distinct spots. I guess three. Like her arms and hands technically could be said to be doing overlapping action and follow through because she's holding them out loosely. Technically her head too, I guess. But where are the two big points here? Hair in her dress, yeah. So what's really interesting about like using the hair in the dress is that hair, you can see that the way that they're dealing with this is each, I guess, lock you could call it. They almost seem to move like in a row, separately, and so you can see like each lock seems to like lift up one before the other, and it creates this like really interesting trail of them. So there's like a almost engineering way to think about the motion because they don't really change much. You know, the curl of them don't really distort at all. So you can see like there's kind of a method to an exactness to the way that her hair moves. And the other cool thing about the dress is based on the placement and the composition here. You know, you're really not animating a full dress with the bottoms of the dress moving around. It's that these are just lines. These are just like lines in an arc, and you can even a new animator can think about can do that. Just, you know, a nice smooth arc. So you're getting a real sense of, and you do actually see how the drag happens, because see, it winds up there and then recoils back. So like it kind of comes forward and stops and then retreats like at the end of the spin. By the way, but see, that's just lines. It's not like you have to do the, you know, exact folds of the cloth. So that's kind of interesting how this all works together. And then I'm gonna volunteer to be like the band that has to go after the Rolling Stones here, but like the garage band that has to go over the Rolling Stones here. But take a second to like recalibrate your brain from a lot of frames Disney animation to like what can we do in the shortest amount of frames video game attack animation. So here's the princess's attack animation when she casts a spell, and again, she's a follow-through heavy character. Her braid whips into the air. Her dress blows back because she's casting like a big, or she's like putting out a big magical attack, and that causes blowback. But then what we did with her, again, the shawl, we really played around with like letting it have a lot of different volumes, because we quickly realized this could be something really cool. Like other characters, when they attack, they have motion trails on their attack, especially Nemo. He has a big swooshy motion trail because he's using like a wooden sword. But the princess, we wanted to have like a swooshy motion trail for her spell to kind of accentuate the idea of like, again, game feel and make the attack feel like super awesome to pull off. But she already had these things hanging from her you know, on her in her design. But we're like, well, what if we use that as a motion trail? And then that sort of like evolved into this thing is like actually the means through which she casts her spells. It's like not like a magic thing, but it's sort of like, I don't know, the equivalent of a wand. It's just sort of like her tool in casting spells. So we were like, well, what if it gets really big when she casts something? All the way to the point of like when she jumps, she doesn't jump conventionally. She kind of like blows the shawl down, and then it starts like makes a little tornado around her. So it almost like stops becoming clothing and becomes like magic power. But, you know, the idea here is like we used its natural follow through and accentuated it by turning it into a motion blur, where, you know, otherwise we might just have like a motion blur on a character. So, you know, this is kind of like, again, follow through to an extreme, but then she also has like her hair, her dress, other elements. So this is taking, you know, overlapping action and follow through to kind of an extreme. That being said, ask me 2 questions before moving on. Also, thank you for, you know, responding in the chat to stuff. 2 questions. Can they be about anything? Yes. Like, certainly ask me questions if you want to ask about the course content, but yes, they can be about anything. Favorite OST? Ooh. Well, I do listen to a lot of video game soundtracks for work time just because it's really good instrumental music. Ooh, that's tough. I've been going back to the Undertale one a lot. The only downside about the original soundtrack for Undertale is that it's weirdly utilitarian, excuse me. So like, whereas a normal original soundtrack album for a video game might have a few loops of a song, it just has like the one loop and then moves on to the next track, and it's weirdly just like, again, like I said, utilitarian in that way. And it's like, oh, I'd really like to listen to Bone Trousel for like 3 or 4 minutes instead of like 1. So I like that one a lot, but I feel like if I'm listening to Undertale, I usually find a remix album. I don't know. Otherwise, like, I've been into Mega Man or Castlevania albums recently. Final Fantasies are always classic. All right, so that's one question. Good question, though. It's a getting to know you question. So one more question. In Blender, is it possible to change the grease pencil color in a given layer without all the strokes becoming that color? Or do you always need to make a new layer? Well, color has nothing to do with layer. It's because of material. So if you're going to change a color of a particular stroke, you have to assign it you have to make a new material, basically. What's my favorite cartoon? Ooh. I really like What's Opera Doc, which is, of course, kill the wabbit, kill the wabbit. So I'm a big fan of What's Opera Doc. There's others, but like that's the easy like one that I always put in all my like I put that. That's why it's a case study. Because it's a great cartoon, but I also happen to really think it's excellent for a lot of reasons. Okay, but those are good questions. So the next principle, you asked good questions, I shall reward you with a principle of animation. And that principle is slow in, slow out. So this one's actually pretty simple. But it's simple, but it's also, I think, the one that gets lost the most when you deal with computer animation. And I highlight this because I think this is sort of, I know I struggle with it as somebody who has done, I was learning animation and self-training on animation in a period where there was, as you are, a lot of digital tools for animation, and a lot of those digital tools really sold themselves on this idea of tweening, which is I put a keyframe at 1 and I put a keyframe at 5, and then the computer will interpolate everything between 1 and 5 and give me an animation. And while that's certainly a time saver, the downside of this is that you lose some of the spirit of that animation. So what does this mean? So basically, again, it's draw more frames at the beginning and at the ending of a motion to slow down the animation around the key poses and let you want fewer frames in the middle for motion, just because you want that motion to feel fast. But you want like the key poses to, you want to like cushion them basically. So what does this look like? So again, imagine you're doing a Flash cartoon or a Maya cartoon, and you have a keyframe at 1 and a keyframe at 10, and then Maya or Flash will just like interpolate and tween in between for you. Now this is bad, and here's why this is bad. I liken this to when I was in college. I took a Photoshop class, and I had been using Photoshop for years before that. I took this as like a senior, as kind of a senior blow-off class, thinking like, well, I already know tons of Photoshop. What the heck am I gonna, like, I'll be able to coast here, right? One, I actually did learn some things because, formal training versus like just practice training. But then also what was really nice about it was the, so I got to have feedback, like real professional feedback on my Photoshop work. And, before I was just kind of like using Photoshop, and that in and of itself was like an asset, but I hadn't really had like good feedback on like visual stuff, except for like, high school art. And what happened was my first assignment, they assigned, I don't even remember what it was, but like I put a bunch of blending effects in it, and my teacher said, well, this is good, but it's really Photoshoppy. And that was when it was like, man, this is not going to be a blow-off class. Like, he really wants us to make good stuff. And, it gets into the idea of, a few things. One is like one of the overarching like threads of this class in particular is, what's the difference between like, is it a software class or or theory class is the wrong? Is it like a technique class versus a tool class? It's like a tool training class. And, tool training classes are like the equivalent of, well, hey, professional person, why are you charging me so much when my high school student knows Photoshop? Well, the high school student may know what buttons to press to make things happen in Photoshop, but they don't have a sense of taste or a sense of aesthetic. They don't have aesthetic sensibilities such that you can use Photoshop to make something that is visually appealing and, nice and aesthetically, aesthetically pleasing. And if you ever need any examples of what it looks like when somebody does just know what Photoshop is, like look at Cleveland Brown's Twitter, and they'll like take a picture of Myles Garrett and like put a huge drop shadow and bevel and emboss and plastic wrap and stuff on them. But anyway, I'm digressing here. But the point is that this is where the principles of animation fight with our tools, and where we need to like kind of beat the way that the tool has trained us down to understand like the actual art of this. Because, tools will give us the power to tween, but tweening and having smooth animation. So a lot of young animators, because they're taught on tweening, or just because, it makes logical sense to have everything like nice, evenly spaced out in terms of like timing and spacing, you don't want to have them spaced out. Again, the motion of the ballerina here going into her pose would be very just dead. It would seem artificial and robotic if you just had the version on the left, which is, again, that evenly tweened, interpolated version, versus if you have, some frames padding, like coming out of the first key and then quickly lifting and then, slowly going into the next key. Again, Nemo here, his like middle of his run is very fast, but then around the key poses, he slows in and slows out, and that gives you this sense of like, again, with a character like this, he's a video game character, and you get like a adventure when he's on his ups more, when he's on his up poses. So here's another example of this. Now, you don't actually see all the frames here. This is the pictures of the earless dog that you see here from Eric Goldberg. And by the way, he's an earless dog because if he had ears and a tail, the artist would have had to draw the follow-through and the overlapping action. And for animation tutorials, it's more instructive to not have that extra detail. So you can just like see the character doing keyframes and breakdowns, which if you recall from the spacing and timing lecture, that's what this illustration is for, is demonstrating the concept of keyframes and breakdowns. But the other thing, again, it's instructive insofar as like what is the workflow of follow through and overlapping action. You do your keyframes with pose to pose, and then you go back and you use straight ahead animation to do, the follow through parts, the braids and the ears and the tails and the capes and the dresses. Now, and if it sounds like I'm talking about the principles from last week, all of the principles are cumulative. They all come together to create animation. So we don't just take them as we see them individually. We use everything. This is our whole toolbox of motion. So, but in terms of slow in, slow out, I don't want, you see the keyframes and breakdowns. If you recall, the key poses here are attitude poses, which is there to tell us, like, they're these exaggerated poses here to tell us that this dog is feeling pretty good. He just voted, and he's feeling pretty good about it. Like, he early voted. That's what he's doing. Totally. So he's feeling pretty good about himself. And he's doing kind of a slow, proud walk, like full of himself walk. And to really sell that idea, let's look at the in-between chart. Now, here's where we get a sense of like the slow in, slow out. You see slow in, slow out notated here. So key poses are 1, 17, and then it loops back around to 1. And then the breakdowns are 9 and 25. So those are evenly spaced. Like, the breakdown is right in between the in-between. That's normal. But the slow in, slow out, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 really tightly bunched together on that chart. And then 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 really tightly packed together. So we can imagine that the full version of this animation has a lot of animation going into and out of that attitude pose, and then the like in between part, so like slow in, slow out, fast. It's kind of like it's fast in the middle, and that emphasizes that attitude. All right. Ask me one question for this one. This is a pretty simple one, but like ask me one question. One question. Well, to eat up the dead air here, one of the questions I did get in the last lecture, which I think is worth repeating, is does it take a long time to learn where and when to put frames? And I thought that was a really good question, because what it really got at was like, first, the short answer is yes. But the longer answer, is and I said it this way, I cannot imagine being the people who figured this out, because they had no guides and they were figuring it out. So your J. Stewart Blacktons, your Winsor McKays, those folks, they were inventing this. And then the folks at Disney who are making up these principles of animation, right? So, because your J. Stewart Blackton, he was like, okay, can I get a drawing to move, right? McKay was actually doing some of these principles just by studying motion, natural motion. So if you watch Gertie again, like, you'll see these principles of animation. But you got to remember, the principles were really invented in the 30s at Disney in a formal way, and they're not really like popularly published until the 80s. So, but Disney, some of their, and if you watch 1930s era Disney cartoons, you see these principles come about, but then you kind of see them be like iterated on. It's almost like they would make films not only to do the business of being a cartoon studio, but also they would also do this to learn and iterate on their process. So Three Little Pigs is a very, it's kind of like a stop along the way to Snow White, but it itself is like a stop along the way, like a significant signpost or a significant part of that path from some of the earlier Mickey cartoons and things like that. The Mad Doctor or something. So, you see across all of these cartoons like an iterative process. So does it take a long time? Yes. However, your time can be shortened. Your time and my time can be shortened through, I'm going to do a professor thing here where it's like, we're always asked at the beginning of every semester, oh, do we need to buy the textbooks? And really what that usually means is, can I pass the class without spending money? And I understand why people do that. Textbooks are expensive, but, and we do not I'm not, except for that one quiz, it wasn't really like a quiz. It was like a, open book, try this as many times as you can so that you can learn to find these terms and learn to know what they are quiz. Except for that one, we don't really give you weekly quizzes or something on the book content, because the books are supposed to be guides. And we want you to keep the books afterward, because this is I have them back there, and I've actually had them before teaching here because they are useful guides for me. And, if I want to know, I want the character to do a fast walk, I can go to Goldberg and open it up to that one page that says, here's some common actions and how, what they should be animated on. And I can see fast walk, okay, 8s or 10s, right? So, one, it takes a long time, but it can be lowered by using references. And again, that's why the Williams book is literally called the Survival Kit, because it is it is the massive database of information. Plus, you also have things like Cartoon Brew, Animation Workshop, all these other tutorial sites on animation as well that exist. So you have all these things. Your time can be shortened that way. But it's also why we give you these exercises to do, and why we are positioning your homeworks in such a way that your homework, your final projects will just be things that you do in homework, but they'll count more, and maybe you work on them over the course of several weeks instead of just 1 week. The homeworks exist to just give you practice. And that's why we have times for projects and times for homeworks set aside through homeworks, is that so they don't cross over each other, they don't overlap, they don't divide your attention, and the homeworks are just practice. They are iterative practice, because it takes a long time to master this stuff. You can know it intellectually, but sometimes you'll like put down the Richard Williams frames exactly, and you're like, that isn't quite what I wanted. So then you start like playing with it, and you start like moving keyframes around in Blender, adding new in-betweens, things like that. So I thought that question was worth repeating because it does actually get to the core of why we're doing the things we do and why you have the materials you have, is because, yes, it takes a long time. It can be shortened by not doing your literal homework, doing your literal homework because your homework is practice, but also by just engaging the knowledge of the field and the advice of people who have come before you. But again, like, you'll really master it by doing it and feeling it. And again, that's why hand drawing is good, because you feel it more there versus when you do it through clicking. But you're doing it in here by hand and in character animation with computer in Maya, because it's almost like you're learning to strong arm Maya and tell Maya to shut the heck up and stop being Maya for a second and like do what you want it to do. So also, a thing that I should point out, and let me know if that spurred any questions, but I will say this. I have an example of me iteratively playing with some slow in, slow out here on a character animation that I'm doing for Nemo, for the character Dr. Pill, who's going to be our like shopkeeper. And his thing is like, we're kind of building him up to be a snake oil salesman. So let me, there's Dr. Pill, and then I'm going to hit the play button here. And so it's kind of fast right now, but so the idea is like, you see this pause here for 2 frames. And I'm animating this on ones, but at half speed. So it comes across as twos. And I'll explain that in a second, why I'm doing it that way in particular. But if you see, we have like 2 frames here. I'm going to put an in-between of him like kind of gingerly picking up his hand. And then you see here, like, that'll go into him where like his bag is going to start doing stuff. So it like squashes and he's like, uh-oh. And then it stretches, and then he does this swoop, and then it starts to like, basically his like cart comes out of it. It launches his cane, which does a little tumble through the air. So he's reached his stop point, and he's like now looking up at the cane while this like continues to poof out. It's very heavily based on the merchant from Aladdin for Sega Genesis, which was actually animated by Disney people. But then the cart continues to like bounce around while he's catching, and then he catches it. So this is where I need to add another in between to take him from catch to ta-da. So he needs an in between there. But you see, having an in between there and having an in between there, like a new in between, is going to do a lot of work to create a slow in, slow out into, because like these are also grouped closely together, so this animation will be slower to prep for this sort of like shoop. And actually this motion here provides us a see the orientation of this. This provides us a nice view of the next principle, which is arcs. But the reason I'm animating this on ones but at half speed, which is effectively like 12 frames per second, but is still like drawing 12 frames, is that because I'm doing a game animation, I don't want to, when I render this out, I don't want to render 2 of every frame. Because the thing with game animation is you try to do as much as you can with as few frames as you can. and every image you render as a sprite is going to take up extra memory space, which will drive up the memory size of your game. So I actually that's why I'm animating in such a weird thing instead of the normal 24 frames per second, which you're all doing, because I'm trying to save memory size, even though it's effectively the same animation speed. But I also mentioned this in the last class. Game animation for hand-drawn sprites is very different. It uses principles in very different ways, and you could see kind of like how we had to stuff a lot of motion into the princess's attack, because you can't have this long, luxurious arm motion with an attack, because the attack has to happen as soon as the button is pressed, and then the player needs to be able to continue going. And so you might even like never see the full attack animation because it's interrupted by the player is going to like keep moving forward. So, and or maybe do another action. So like there is actually in game animation a lot of ways you almost undermine or have to like use the principles in a very different way when you're doing this kind of stuff. You answered, is there a stark difference between game animation and traditional animation? Yes. It is everything. Again, watch. So I yes, I already answered it, but I will repeat it in a concise way. If you watch that's why I said you had to recalibrate your brain when going from Sleeping Beauty to Slumberland Princess. She looks super choppy compared to Sleeping Beauty, but remember that they have like just basically all the space they want to do all the frames of animation they want, and make it super smooth. Whereas this is like everything is at the mercy of button presses. And button presses, so like reactivity, so game feel, and memory size. Those are the things there. And if you do watch, like, for example, it might be in the case studies, but the animation of Overwatch talk from GDC a few years ago, that's one of the points that the animator made is like, oh my gosh, they let us be animators and like do squashy and stretchy and follow-through-y stuff that they don't normally get to do with like the first-person camera animations. Thank you for that question. So, which brings us to the next thing, which is arcs. So yeah, you saw a little arc in Dr. Pill. Here's another arc. Actually, here's another example of a game animation that's different. Why does the mosquito just go straight to the attack, the dive? Why doesn't he have a transition frame? Well, because that would delay the game action. So in all, you wouldn't even have like a 2-frame hold the way I have here at the top of the wind up. I just wanted it to be slower for the PowerPoint. He's basically going to wind up and then go. And again, in a video game, you're not going to see that. You're not going to see that it does just sort of like weirdly instantly turn into a dive. You're just like, oh crap, get it out of the way or kill it. So arcs. This one's simple. Most natural motion happens in arcs. So use them. That's it. So like kind of when you're doing stuff, like we move in arcs. That's the way our bodies work. Like our bodies do arc things. That's the way our joints work. So, make sure that if you are animating, a good example is, oh man, I hate it when I'm giving a lecture and I'm like, oh my gosh, I should have totally included a slide of something. Well, here's one of those situations. We've talked about the history of animation. We've talked about the 20s and 30s, and we talked about Rubber Hose. And if you've played Cuphead, like that's a breaking this principle to get an aesthetic example. So they did Rubber Hose because they were trying to do 20s and 30s animation. So Rubber Hose, of course, is like the characters don't have bones. Their arms are rubbery, and they don't have what you call a joint break, which is where like, your arm bends at the joint, or at a limb bends at the joint. So, arcs was a principle employed to master the idea that our arms have particular anatomy, and the anatomy is made to move in certain ways. So that is what this is all about. So what I could have put in, maybe should do for next time, is we see that there is a, if you have like that rubber hose animation, that's not really moving in arcs. Like it might make a sine wave or something, but it's not really moving in arcs the way that you get when you have an arm do what arms are like physically constructed to do. So point being, have animation move in you see Robin Hood here, his arms are, I can't get the full chill factor of Robin Hood going while I'm sitting in my, but he moves and his arms move in like smooth arcs, right? And his legs move in smooth arcs, and his tail follow through in smooth arcs, etc., etc. Ears, feather, everything. So unless you're animating something that's been thrown, like, I could pick up one of Will's toys here, and I could throw it, and he's not here, don't worry, I didn't throw it at him. I just threw it, like, against the wall to prove a point. Unless you're, like, throwing something or applying force to something, it's not going to go in a straight line. If you throw something, it's going to go in a straight line because you are applying a force. But, and you recall on the bouncing ball animation, like I gave feedback to a lot of people because they had kind of this going on. And this is that, shortest distance between 2 points interpolation. But, a ball would bounce in an arc. So physical forces do things in arcs because there is a sense of acceleration and deceleration. And then there is also, actually, this is a good example of slow in, slow out. There's slow in, slow out of the bottom of the bounce and the top of the arc. So there's slow in, slow out also there, in addition to squash and stretch. But, and also arcs, because physical forces, because of acceleration, deceleration, use arcs. So here's a Little Mermaid pencil test by Glenn Keane. And so this character, Ariel, Ariel works in a lot of arcs, and it's a mix of like arcs and follow through because she's underwater, but she has lots of body movements that are in arcs because she's underwater and doesn't have like a ground to physically push off of. So everything is an arc. It's basically like butterfly kick, if you are familiar with swimming, but it's like sort of like fin kick you do with like a butterfly mermaid kick, but then her hair moves in arcs, but that's also follow through. You start to see these things bleed together, and again, you want to think about these things bleeding together in animation, because again, you're using all the principles at once. It's not like, oh, now is the time for this one at a time. Animations are made of kind of all of them. So again, there's an arc. There's lots of arcs on a character like Ariel. And then, it doesn't just have to be bodies with joints. When I add arcs to a character like this, or Dr. Pill, where he's doing his little shoop thing, I could have just had the face straight, transition in a straight line, but by having it move in kind of an arc and then having some light follow through on the nose, which you can't quite see, but it's totally there. There's like a smushy frame to this. In there, that gives you a much smoother transition between these two these two expressions. And then to even arcs just make the animation feel more fluid and feel smoother. So another example is like, look at the craters on the top of his head and around his cheeks. They even move in little arcs, again, because they could just straightforward interpolate, but I wanted to smooth them out and like add a little bit more of an arc to them. And again, it makes it feel more fluid and interesting. I'm not going to ask a question about arcs simply because it's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to power through to the end here, and then we can ask questions then. So secondary action. Basically, it's the principle of any other actions that you can add to a scene apart from the main action to give it life. Now, I already mentioned this earlier because when we looked at overlapping action, so what's the difference between overlapping and secondary? So overlapping is different parts of the body move on different timings, and it's usually associated with the delay in timing that parts of the body that are physically reacting to the main motion have. So like the delay, when the head is going like this and the braid is going like that, and then the head goes down but the braid still goes up for a frame or two before joining up with the body and like having a downward motion, that's overlapping. It's sort of like the domino effect of motion, whereas secondary is literally one part of your body is doing something while the other part of your body is doing something else. So it's not that you're like multitasking, it's that so like let's look at Nemo here. So Nemo spends most of his time in the comic doing this, basically being like, being amazed, right? Or terrified. But often amazed. Starts amazed, ends terrified. So we needed like some frames of animation to show him being like, ah. Now, so part of that is like, we're going to have really big creatures, and I wanted like a look up animation. So I could have very easily had him just be like, but that didn't feel very interesting. So like here immediately I'm using anticipation by having him be like, now, and that's easy. And a little squash of like him bending his body. Cool. But that was still kind of boring. So what I did is I added the little arm motion. Now, there's always like some hands out, like, so, but that's why I added the little like push down. And technically, like, I'm breaking a rule of animation by having the arms move together like that. It's not that you never want to do that. It's that like you don't always want to do it all the time. So, but for the pose, it works. And for, creating the visual language of Winsor McCay, it works. So, but by doing that, by having that arm motion in addition to the lookup, and again, paired with a overlapping action on the sword, squash and stretch on the bounce, anticipation by having him do a little down before it goes up, you create a much more interesting action. And it feels more like a whole being by having something else to do. Now, the king of secondary action, the most easily understood common use of secondary action, is a run cycle. Because when you run, unless you're like, being a character from Saturday Night Live that's supposed to be like, socially awkward character, like, when I was in high school, it would be Mary Catherine Gallagher, who would always like move around with her arms like this. And that was supposed to be like the way that she showed that she was awkward. Most people and most characters are going to move their arms in some way when they run. Now, that motion can vary based on like what the needs of the animation are. So, or like the personality or the character. So Nemo, again, he's very bouncy and he holds on his ups because he's like the wow adventure kid. Peony, right behind Nemo. She's like Slumberland Special Forces, so she's not going to bounce as much. She's doing like a ninja run, and the ninja run, gives her more of a sense of like control. Even though she's still doing some stuff because like physical reality, we're not animating Naruto. And then the princess, we've already looked at her run, but she's holding her dress up, so she doesn't move her arms back and forth, but her motion causes like her shoulders to shift. And then Flip, he's kind of gruff and he wants to always be ready to fight, so he like keeps his arms up and like does one of these kind of runs. And you see some follow through, by the way, on Flip on the tails of his jacket. So but this is like the king of secondary motion, and that's why we have you do run cycles and walk cycles, so that you can practice the like you're having the character walk, but then you're also having the character do something with their arms while they're walking, because again, that's a great way to do secondary action. Here we have Mushu from Mulan, and you'll see a few animation principles here. So like first you see slow in, slow out. If you look at the head position, the blue circles, you see slow in, slow out on the arm motion, but you see like two different actions here. And this arm motion is actually part overlapping in that there's some physical force to it, but it also is a different secondary action because he's raising his arms. That's not because of the momentum, that is because he's raising his arms. So, and then, squash and stretch because he's going down, anticipation because he's going down, a smear with stretch because it's really fast. But, the secondary action is really interesting because it's moving at a different trajectory. He's slowing in, and then it moves super fast because he is raising his arms to express something. It's been a while since I've seen Mulan. So I can't remember exactly what he's doing. I think, you know what? I think this is when he first appears. And he's trying to like look and sound super impressive. But you see like that transition is you get a slow in, and then the middle is super fast to the point where you get a stretch frame, and then it comes up. But that, this motion in it, like instead of just, raising his head up, having this secondary motion happening while the rest of his body is doing something different is a much more interesting action than, again, him just being like that. And even then I did a secondary motion because I made my arms go like this. So it's almost like you're adding layers of motion. You're having like a main motion, but you have micro motions that make that character more interesting. I have two enemies from Nemo. Wang Doodle on the left. His main motion is like, this is his idol. He just floats, but then he kind of like his part of his like coiled up tentacle undulate, and that's kind of like a secondary, like a little secondary motion. His eye blinks. His eye blinks in a super steady fashion, not because of like lack of slow in, slow out. We just wanted it to be like creepy and long. We were like, oh, that'll be unsettling. It's just like one big eye that like goes. But then you see a very like, all while it's like slow creepy stuff, he's like throwing the thing, like the projectile that he throws at the player behind him. He's tossing it up and down, like he's bored and he's got a baseball. In fact, that's where this creature is from. It's from a Little Nemo comic where they're playing baseball on Mars. And the Wang Doodle doesn't look like a giant eyeball. I just thought it'd be creepier if he was a giant eyeball than like a weird face like he is in the comic. But yeah, so there's the secondary motion. And then you get some secondary motion also in this Robo Bird where it's moving its head, but it's also kind of a reaction to the main flying. This character has a lot of follow through, but you also see inside the bird, the gears are turning, and that's another just like layer of action that gives you a sense of like the realism of this thing. So it just adds like flavor. It adds just more to the character to make it feel more fully realized. And lastly here, now again, keep in mind that this is like the background here is just, this is made to be reused. So that's why there's like, no background. That's why he's like appearing out of nowhere. We use environment art to like make a tower for him to appear behind. And same thing with like, the wall is not just going to be purple. It's going to actually be like environment art. This is just the sprite rendered out of Blender. So Bosco the dragon, who is this like auto travel feature for our game. In the Nemo comic, he is this creature who is like the royal carriage, giant, terrifying royal carriage, who, like he has a chair in his mouth. So he's gonna fly in, and his handler. He flies in and he lands, and he looks at you kind of dopey, and he wags his tail. And the handler sees that he's not really behaving because he didn't like open his mouth to show you the chair. So he hops on him, and then Bosco like puffs out some smoke, and and then the chair is there. Because it's a little more interesting to just like have him maybe inhale and then puff out smoke like a dragon instead of just open his mouth. So that's a little anticipation there. But secondary action here we see, this, you can get lots of secondary action in any situation where you have a character riding something. So, whether that be a vehicle or a like another creature. So if you have a cowboy riding a horse, maybe the cowboy's trying to go fast, so he's going like this, and the horse is galloping, and that gives you like automatic secondary action because you have another thing doing action besides the like actual source of locomotion, which is the horse. Here, Bosco comes in and lays down, but his tail's wagging a little bit for a while, and that's a secondary action. It makes him feel more alive while he's otherwise very still. And then same thing, the guy is doing stuff. He is like shifting his weight on top while the dragon's turning around, both as follow through and again as like just more motion. And then he becomes the like center of attention when he looks over, sees that Bosco's not doing his job, and then jumps up and down on him. And we wanted this guy to be kind of gruff. The way I explained him, I was like, I wanted to give him only 3 more years till I get my pension attitude. So he's just kind of over this whole thing. And then again, you have like other little follow through bits and secondary action bits when like his horns fall forward and stuff like that. So, you can use a lot of these things to just add layers of character building and realism and interest points to this. I don't know. Ask me 2 questions before the class ends, but that's it. That's today's principles of animation. You can ask me these questions while we watch the dragon land and disappear and land into infinity. Two questions, and then I'll shut down the stream. Come on. No questions? How long did it take me to make this animation? This one in particular took a few weeks. I don't know, maybe 2.5 to 3 weeks, just because it is a longer one. This is why you don't have an animated short as a final, because animation, especially hand animation, takes a long time. And if you go through the case studies and the video watching, like the readings and video stuff that we've provided in the syllabus, there actually is like one thing of like a guy who worked on Aladdin while he was working on Aladdin, flipping through his pencil sketches, being like, this 2 seconds took me 3 weeks or 6 weeks or something like that. So yeah, it took a while because I had to, I'm not having somebody else ink and paint this for me. I'm doing all the roughs to figure out the motion, then inking and painting. So yeah, this was a lot. For this week's assignment, do we have to use the character that we did the turnaround? You can always use whoever you want. It's fine. You could create continuity by using the same character, but if you want to try different characters, you can go for it. For reference, how long a few weeks, like 3 weeks. And this is about, it comes out to about 4 seconds. So this is actually one of the long, you normally wouldn't have a game animation take this long, but this is like a special event animation. This is like if anybody's played Hollow Knight, there's the Stag subway, and it's that kind of thing. It's a quick travel, but that's what this character is for. And even then, they just did like a very quick cycle that they have like zoom in a little bit. The only thing that the Stag does, that I think the Stag's longest animation would be like when it actually stops and does a little like quick break. So yeah, this is if you look at game animation a lot, and there actually is like a YouTube channel devoted to analyzing game animation, but a lot of it is just cycles and quick stuff because of memory limits, but also because of just like, how long animation takes. So again, this is a very long one, and it's because we're being like a little self-indulgent, but we're also trying to use, hey, look at our animation, isn't it neat? Don't you think it makes this game complete? I make that joke a lot. But it's that's like one of our selling points. So we're okay with spending some more time, like on 3 weeks on a 4-second animation and that's again from rough to ink and paint. It's not just like it took me 3 weeks to draw all these drawings. It's that I drew these drawings multiple times over those weeks. It took me maybe like 2 days to do the roughs, but then inking and painting took longer, obviously because this is a detailed character. But that's like those are the cost of effort calculations that you make when you do projects like this. Is like, is this worth it? And for us, this is a selling point. We literally said like, okay, we want this kind of thing for the trailer to be like, look at what our game is going to have in it. So we wanted to kind of go all out on stuff like this. But yeah, animation takes a long time, and that it does include, if anybody's thinking, oh, well, thank God I use Maya because that saves me so much time. I spent 6 months on animations for characters, like just on the player character for my one game, Dead Man's Trail, because we had a huge arsenal of different weapons you can have. So doing all the run cycles, all the walk cycles, all of the firing, reloading, all those animations for our characters, and again, trying to make the animations look nice, took about 6 months. And that was just like, that was all I worked on was those rigs. And then that was when That was thankfully when Mechanim had just come out for Unity, so that you could like make one animation, and then as long as the rigs were all the same, or like they had the same basic structure, you could just copy all the animations over. That used to not be an option. You used to have to do it like individually. You know, but it took 6 months to do that for one character, and then we were able to put it onto other characters. So animation, no matter what tool you're using, takes a long time. And with that, I'm gonna stop making this lecture take a long time, and I'm going to head out. But I will talk to you next week. This has been great. Looking forward to seeing your animations. I'll get caught up on grading, but otherwise, have a great rest of